Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to discuss the Orville, and I often said in my reviews of the show that it feels as if it's a good remake of Star Trek, that it took the best ideas from the older Star Trek shows and did it even better in some ways sometimes, not always. And I will break down exactly what I think was better or worse about this show compared to the older Star Trek shows. But overall I think it did a good job, it really captured the spirit, it captured what was the best in Star Trek, and it kind of cleaned it up, it shed all the stupid parts, and it kind of concentrated those best ideas into less episodes, so it often feels like it's a distilled, concentrated version of Star Trek with a little more comedy and with brand new characters, and so it's like a remake of Star Trek in a good way most of the time. But it's not perfect, and I do have a bit of criticism toward the Orville. And my number one criticism is the lack of originality. They take all their ideas that were done before, and even if they do improve on those ideas, the ideas still are not original most of the time. In most episodes of the Orville, it's just recycling the same ideas. So even though they do improve them sometimes, I still would rather see brand new ideas. Now, there were a few episodes of the Orville which really did introduce new ideas, which I didn't see on Star Trek or on any other science fiction show that I saw. Some of them were taken from various books, but it's still a good thing to bring it to the TV screen for the first time. And so that was the height of the Orville, in my opinion, whenever I saw an episode with a brand new idea which I didn't see before on TV. That was when the Orville was at its best, in my opinion, because it wasn't just an imitation of Star Trek, it wasn't just a remake of Star Trek, but it was actually like a new Star Trek. It was the same spirit, the same style, but with new stories and new ideas, and that's where the Orville was at its best, in my opinion. And unfortunately, it's kind of rare on the Orville to have these new ideas. Most of the time, it's just the same ideas, and so that's my number one criticism against the Orville. So I wish they would be doing more totally new ideas, even though I know it's harder nowadays to do new ideas which no one thought about before. It's almost impossible, it's much more challenging than it was before, so I get that. But I do think it's possible. They did do that in a few episodes. And if we think back about what really made Star Trek so good in the past, because they were doing new ideas that no one else did before. At least not on TV. I know probably there's a book with almost every idea you can imagine. There was probably some book with that idea, but not everybody were doing that on TV. And so that's why Star Trek was so good, and it was also visionary in many ways. It predicted stuff that really came true later, like cell phones, like touchscreens. It showed stuff that didn't exist at the time that show aired. And that's also something that is kind of lacking in the Orville, because everything they show in the Orville is the same stuff that we saw on Star Trek, and they don't really show us something new which doesn't exist yet, which might exist in the near future. The Orville didn't really do that. I can't remember anything creative like that which they invented, which will predict the future later. I don't think so. Even that episode which I praised with the upvotes and downvotes society, it's basically like a parody of today, which is a good thing. I love that episode. But imagine if that kind of episode came out, let's say in Star Trek a few decades ago. How amazing would that be, that they actually managed to predict something that is coming true in society. And I do think Star Trek did manage to predict all kinds of stuff that really came true in our society, and not just technological stuff, but even, even the internet. We can say the whole idea of the Borg in Star Trek kind of predicted the internet, how we behave with the internet. When the first episode about the Borg aired, I think the internet didn't really exist yet. Maybe it was in the early stages, but most of the population was not using it yet. And so there was no way of knowing how exactly humanity would change and how people would behave as a result of having this collective in the internet. And I think they really predicted human behavior with how they showed the Borg behaving, because we always see the Borg being hooked up to their collective, which is sort of like the internet. And if you disconnect a Borg from his collective, he would want to go back to it at all costs. It's like he's addicted to it. And also all the Borg who are hooked up to the collective, they are not paying attention to what's really going on in front of them in reality, because their brains are all in their collective. And this is the way people really are behaving today. Like if someone is at the computer, in the internet, or on his cell phone, sometimes he doesn't notice what's going on in real life around him. And so this is really funny to me how Star Trek basically predicted something that really is happening in society today, and most likely we will end up sort of like that eventually. So Star Trek was always kind of innovative in that way. It was inventing things that will come true later. Of course, it's not the only show, it's not the only science fiction to do that, but it always presented those kinds of ideas relatively fresh on TV, meaning not a lot of people did that already in movies and TVs. So Star Trek was relatively very creative in a lot of ways. So if I compare it to the Orville, I can't really think of a lot of things that the Orville introduced to TV, which we didn't see a lot of times before. I can't really see anything truly imaginative and truly new which we didn't see before. The Orville didn't really invent something like that which no one saw before on TV. And so that's a problem. Again, I don't really blame the Orville because nowadays it's nearly impossible. It's getting harder and harder. And so I understand it's not that easy, but still I would have much appreciated to see some brand new ideas. The only examples I can really think of were when they found that ship with the whole planet inside and those people didn't know they're on a starship. That was a neat idea which we didn't see a lot on TV. The various different cultures with a strange society like the downvote, upvote society or the one ruled by astrology. So I very much appreciated those episodes. And also on the ship itself, we did have a few relatively fresh ideas. The character Yaphet, who is that gooey creature, which is not a new idea, but it's the first time I see them play around with such a character on a live television show. To have a character of that gooey shapeshifter kind of creature, which is in that state all the time. We had that with Odo on Deep Space Nine, but Odo most of the time was just a human. Like only once in a while we saw a special effect of him changing shapes, which is understandable because of the limitation of the special effects back then. So again, the Orville enjoys having those abilities to play around with the ideas that the older shows couldn't. But at least with this character, they actually exploit these new abilities and these new special effects to really bring to life an idea that is an old idea from science fiction, but we didn't really see it that much, and so that is an example of a very good thing in the Orville. But other than that, did we really see anything on the ship which we didn't see before? Not so much in my opinion. You know, all the different aliens which are just humans in makeup, that's old science fiction which doesn't feel fresh in any way. The character of Isaac and the Kalons are basically robots. That's one of the oldest science fiction ideas, so nothing really original there. So when I think about it, I can't really see anything creative about the ship itself, anything inside the ship. So the character of Yaphet probably the only example I can think of something relatively creative and imaginative, and the fact that they play around with him and they use his abilities in the episodes, that's great. So I wish we would have more exotic aliens. I wish we would have, you know, at least one more strange alien. Like they do have a few strange aliens once in a while, but they're kind of not doing anything with them, so that's a small problem in the Orville. I think they didn't really have enough exotic aliens, and with today's special effects they can do a lot more in my opinion. So I wish they would begin to play around with all kinds of exotic stuff and exotic brand new ideas. They did have that episode with that giant flower creature, so I guess that is a good example of something I want to see. That's a neat idea, to have an alien, intelligent alien who is actually a plant, a vegetable. So that is a nice idea, but the execution wasn't that good. It looked kind of cartoony in my opinion. So maybe something like that should be done with more practical special effects to look more realistic. But that was a good example of something they tried to do something a little more exotic, so I like that. And as for the stories themselves, most of them, as I said, are kind of remakes of the same ideas and same stories that we saw on Star Trek. But sometimes they do improve on them. Sometimes they kind of concentrate those good ideas, they kind of shed all the silly stuff that shouldn't be there, they kind of get rid of it and they only keep the best ideas. Sometimes they combine a few good ideas from different episodes in the old Star Trek shows and combine them together in a neat new way, which I would even say is transformative. Like, I'm not a copyright expert, but I think even if that ever went to court, I think even if they were the same ideas because they did them differently, then that's okay in my opinion. And also, especially if it's an old idea that was, 50 years ago in the old Star Trek show, I think personally copyright should be time limited anyway, so I don't have any problem with that, kind of legally speaking. Sometimes I did get annoyed at the Orville when the entire episode was nothing but the old ideas from Star Trek and nothing new at all added to it, then it was a little bit annoying. But if I think of it as a remake, then I'm fine with that. If I think, this is Star Trek for a new generation, for people who didn't see the old one, maybe it's kind of okay. And obviously the special effects, all the space shots, all of that does look much better than the old Star Trek shows did, simply because of better special effects technology. So obviously in that sense the Orville is better, but I don't think it's fair to judge and compare shows based on special effects alone. I'm not saying we should totally ignore that, because visual effects are a very big important part of any science fiction movie or show, so I'm not saying we should ignore that, but I think it's not the only factor to make a show entertaining in the visual or audio sense. I think good acting, good music, good sets, imagination with your props, stuff like that is also important. It's not only the space scenes which are important. And when I compare the Orville to the old Star Trek shows, I do think all the space scenes are much better in the Orville because of the better special effects, but everything else is not always as good. And therefore, if they remake the same idea, but one of the other factors is lacking, for example, the acting isn't as good, or the music isn't as good, or the internal sets are not as creative or not as interesting, then it does kind of damage it. And that's when I see it as kind of a bad remake. It's the same idea, but done not as good as the original, and then I do get a little bit annoyed at that, because I think to myself, someone will watch the Orville first and they will think that's so brilliant, and they will never watch that original episode that it's recycling, which might have been a lot better in many ways. For example, the episode Who Watches the Watchers in TNG, they did an episode very similar to that in the Orville, but the acting, if you compare Patrick Stewart to Seth MacFarlane, I love Seth, but he's not as good of an actor as Patrick Stewart was. Patrick Stewart in some scenes was really brilliant, really well done, and he made those stories really feel real to you. He really brought it to perfection with his acting, and so that's why when I compare it, it's kind of frustrating to me. It could have been better, and the music was often much better in the old Star Trek shows, and so all of that is part of my enjoyment of an episode or a movie. So when I make this comparison, I don't just look at this visual special effects, I also look, how well the sets are built, how good the acting is, how good the music is. All of those factors are part of what makes it great. And the Orville is sometimes lacking on some of those other factors, and so that's my problem in a few episodes, that they didn't really do it as well as it could have been done. And therefore I can't say that it's better than the old Star Trek. I wish I could. I wish everything was better. If all those factors were better on the Orville, then I would be able to come and say, the Orville is even better than the old Star Trek shows. But the fact is it's not. It's often lacking in some of those other elements. And as for the things I think the Orville did improve, I will give you a few examples. They totally ditched the idea of the transporter, the teleporter. They're always using the shuttle to go from place to place, and I think that's great, because on Star Trek they kind of relied on the transporter too much. It became like a lazy plot device. They always use the transporter to save someone in the last second, and it's always so easy. Or when they don't want to have that ability, then they have to come up with excuses for why they can't use the transporter, and so it became really annoying after a while to keep saying, we can't use this, we can't use that, we can't use this, we can't use that. The Orville totally solved that problem from the get-go by simply not having the transporters from the beginning, and also seeing the shuttle fly around. That's also visually entertaining, more than just seeing the person dematerialize and materialize, which got really old fast in my opinion. It got annoying after a while. And so the Orville kept that for special occasions. They did show that more advanced aliens do have transporters, but the normal ship, the normal crew doesn't have it, and so they do that only once in a while. So that's great in my opinion. That solves an issue I had with Star Trek, of them having too many tricks up their sleeves and then having to come up with excuses for why they can't use them. And also it creates a whole bunch of contradictions with various situations and so on. So Orville solved that problem very elegantly by simply choosing what technologies they want to have or not from the beginning. So what else did the Orville do better than Star Trek? As I often say, they took the best ideas, they took the inspiration, the spirit of Star Trek, the same core values, same ideas, and they're playing around with them in their own way. And in that, they even do it better in some ways, because Star Trek was kind of hypocritical in a lot of ways, and I'll make probably a whole bunch of videos on those topics, because they tried to show us an utopian future in which humanity became perfect. They solved all the social problems, they have the perfect morality, which is a very nice idea, but kind of problematic on a TV show, and yet they self-contradicted themselves a lot of times, and I'll make a whole bunch of videos on this topic in the near future, but it was kind of annoying in a way, because it made it feel like the show is lying to me. Like, they always tell me, humanity is so great now, everything is, and then they show us a whole bunch of evil admirals. Every second admiral we see is some kind of asshole and immoral and all that stuff, and so that kind of made me say, wait a minute, so the Federation is not really an utopia, it's a dystopia. Only our heroes are the good guys, and even they are not always the good guys, because they had the stupid Prime Directive, which not always it was stupid, but sometimes it was extremely immoral in my opinion, and that was also kind of a morality contradiction. So wait a minute, so the writers didn't really think it through to the end, so many times they were acting immorally. And so that really kind of ruined the whole idea for me. And also, they kind of avoided difficult topics. They didn't want to get into politics too much. And so they kept saying, the Federation is this perfect society, but they never really explained the details of it, because I guess they didn't know how. And so I think that kind of stuff is actually done better on the Orville. First of all, they never claim they're perfect people. They always show all the flaws of all the characters. So they're much more like the people of today, which makes the show kind of more realistic than Star Trek in a way. Because they show us that they are like normal people of today, which are good people, but not perfect. So they don't have that kind of annoying, pompous feeling that, especially in the early TNG, I remember, they were really kind of sounded kind of pompous, like, we're evolved humans, we no longer do this or that, and then they contradict themselves later in the series when they do all those things. And so that made it kind of really annoying, kind of childish. And so on the Orville, they don't try to show them all as some kind of perfect people. And then there are no contradictions. When they make mistakes, when they do things that are not totally morally perfect, then it's fine because they are never claimed to be perfect. And so there are less contradictions, which is a good thing. And when they did go into politics, they actually did it better than Star Trek. They showed the complexity of the issue, like the whole episode about that Maklan colony of females and how it got involved in the politics of the Union and how they had to decide what to do. Like they had to balance out the different sides and to reach a compromise and all of that. That was so well done in the Orville in that episode. And when I compare it to Star Trek was kind of much more childish and silly in many ways with that kind of situation. They didn't really show the complexity of it enough. Sometimes they did, but a lot of times it was kind of too black and white. Like, oh, those are the bad guys, these are the good guys, and that's it. Which is not really that educational, it's not that clever. I much prefer the intellectual episodes with some kind of a debate on some kind of a real political issue, sometimes as a metaphor to a real issue. And when it's not black and white, when it's complex question, it's much more interesting because it's a topic which we can debate sometimes for decades later because it's a really difficult question. It's not a black and white question. It's something much more complex, and that's what makes it interesting. Star Trek did often do it very well, but not always. A lot of times they really miss the ball, and the Orville, I feel like it's doing it even better, like it's smarter than the old Star Trek shows. Maybe simply because they kind of pick the best ideas, and also Orville is able to make it relevant to today. They did kind of pick topics which are still relevant today. And also what the Orville is doing better is that they always tie the stories to the characters on the show itself, to the regular characters. In Star Trek, a lot of times they would introduce brand new characters to tell a story, and then that character would disappear and we'll never find out what happened next. And sometimes that was good because it kind of left it open-handed, but a lot of times they could have done a lot more with that, they could have developed it more, and I feel like on the Orville they really do develop kind of a continuous story arcs, like the whole thing with the Maklans, the society of the Maklans, they really develop it well on the Orville. In Star Trek, most times they would meet some planet, they would have some kind of story with that planet, and then we never hear about that planet again. Which sometimes is good, but a lot of times it was kind of missed opportunity. They could have developed that idea better. And the same with regular characters, like for example, there were a lot of episodes in TNG in which Data made friends with some kid, some child, which was always very fun, but then that child always disappeared, and then later he would befriend some other child. But it was never a continuous relationship. Meanwhile, on the Orville, we have continuous relationships, we have a long story arc of the character, like Isaac befriending those children of Dr. Finn, and it's a continuous story, and in TNG it was always some new kid which Data befriended. And then we never see him or her again, and then he befriends some other child in a different episode. And so there is less kind of emotional connection. If you have the same character for a long while, then you connect with it much better. That's something that Deep Space Nine even did better, because they had a whole bunch of recurring characters which we get to know and see, like Jake and Nog on Deep Space Nine, so regular kids on the show, instead of just someone who appears once in a while and disappears. And this all ties with the episodic versus serialized nature of the show. I often said the best way, in my opinion, is do what Deep Space Nine did, which is that most episodes have their own story, but also with some overarching storyline connecting all of them. That's, I think, is the best way. That way you enjoy from the benefit of both of these ways. And the Orville is doing that way, like Deep Space Nine. They do have a story in each episode, but also have things running from episode to episode. And that is the best balance between these two approaches, in my opinion. And so the bottom line is I do think the Orville is in many ways better than the old Star Trek shows, but not in every way. And my biggest gripe with it, my biggest complaint is that they don't have enough original, fresh, new stories. That's what I really want to see. Only then I would truly love it. I really love those episodes in which they did do that, especially in season 1. They did have a few episodes with brand new ideas, which we didn't see a lot of on TV, and that's what I wish they would keep doing. That's what I want to see. So that's it for now. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and we can discuss it, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.